Hi, everyone. I'm Ronnie Scott. I'm a novelist and I'm an academic in the creative writing program at RMIT University. And welcome to the Wheeler Center Double Book Club. Before I introduce our guests in this wonderful Double Book Club, I would just like to acknowledge that well, of course, we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nations, and those lands were never ceded. So we pay respects to their elders past and present and emerging. But of course, also because we're live streaming this event, which is a slightly unprecedented circumstance, obviously because of world events of which we're all aware. We're actually going out to lots of different places and lots of different people, and so we pay our respects to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today as well. So our books in this double book club are Here Until August by Josephine Rowe and Sweetness and Light by Rowe and Pieper. And it's clear to anyone who's read Rowe and Pieper or Josephine Rowe that they're two of the best fiction or non-fiction writers working in Australia today. And I'm really proud to say that I'm a completist of both. This is an interesting double book club because of the different resonances between their works, as well as their different histories in Australian literary communities. And I could introduce them together, and I thought about that, because as well as those deep roots in the communities, as well as those resonances that may be obvious, and which we'll kind of talk about at the start, I think that there are lots of sort of hidden ones, which will come out as we talk about the books more and more. And so I think that that's the best reason to welcome them both separately, so that they can come out kind of more naturally than that, and maybe they'll have questions for each other as well. So I'll start with Josephine Rowe. Josephine Rowe is joining us via feed tonight. Hi, Josephine.
Hello.
Josephine Rowe is the author of several story collections, including Tar Cut Awake, and the novel A Loving, Faithful Animal, which was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award in 2017, and it was a New York Times editor's choice. And it deals with the legacy of the Vietnam War in Australia, which is a topic that people touch on actually surprisingly rarely here, I think. And her new collection, Here Until August, is a book of 10 stories that you can also kind of link together in various ways. There's stories about grief, there's stories about place, there's some strange kind of themes on animals, which we can talk about. There's stories about thresholds and resistances and lots of other things as well. But of course, any reader of Josephine Rowe knows that the unifying feature is really attention to detail. And attention to silence, which seems like the opposite of detail, but which is also a kind of detail. And often the most important action in the story is going on kind of underneath the page. So they're gorgeous stories that put faith in the reader. They trust that they'll spend time with the stories, focusing on the details, focusing on the gaps, while their very careful structures move us towards revelation and clarity. And this book is currently shortlisted for the Stella Prize, which is fantastic. Congratulations, Josephine.
Thank you.
Rowe and Pieper's memoir, The Feel-Good Hit of the Year, was published in 2014, and it was shortlisted for the National Biography Award and the Ned Kelly Best True Crime Award as well. And since that book, Liam published a collection of nonfiction called Mistakes Were Made that examined everything from a brief bout of brain infection to the Chateau Marmont, to various travails of the life of a writer and a dog owner. And his first novel, The Toymaker, was translated into Russian, Italian, and Czech, and it did very well. It's a terrific novel. His new book, Sweetness and Light, which was published earlier this month, it follows two characters who are in search of change in very different ways as they move across a series of scams and salvations and tribulations and towards an inseparable and insuperable fate. So this book also puts wonderful faith in the reader's appetite, I think, to move along its very careful structure towards a sudden, clear, and really quite delicious conclusion, which is the first thing that anyone wants to talk about when you talk to them about this book, and which we won't spoil, just know that it's there. It's a brilliant and a very entertaining novel about the strangeness of people, which we so often mistake for the strangeness of place. So I say good evening to them both.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Good evening, Rowe and Pieper.
Evening.
I guess the first place to start is place itself. I think that that's almost the most obvious thing that your books have in common. And in some ways, it's a strange question, a strange way to start, because when you say that these are works that deal closely with place, you can kind of say that about anything. It's almost like saying this is a book about people or this is a book about love. Those are things that crop up again and again. But I do think that both of these books have quite a critical relationship to place. And I guess in the case of Josephine's book, Here Until August, because it's 10 short stories and because a lot of those stories are about movement, there's a lot of places covered, but that's equally true of Liam's book, Sweetness and Light. I wonder, could you start us off, Liam, with a quick cataloging of the places that are covered in Sweetness and Light and why they are there?
Oh my goodness. Well, Sweetness and Light is set in many cities. Anywhere I've been on holiday recently and have to justify somehow, my characters will find themselves there. It's set primarily in India, on the west coast, in Goa, and in southern India, in Tamil Nadu, and a little bit in the middle. It's set in a lot of places. Also in Newcastle, Australia, New South Wales, and in Long Island, New York City, and Manhattan. And place, yeah, it's one of those things you can't really escape, I think. You know, like love, like people, both of which this book is about. What interests me about place is, well, it's evocative. You know, if you tend to be quite a flowery purple writer, as I can sometimes get before my editors iron it out, you can explore wonderfully evocative emotion through landscape. You know, I love those old-fashioned picaresques, which are now kind of, in which you explore a strange territory, which the reader might not have seen, and really bring it to life in their mind through prose. Those have kind of gone out of fashion as society has moved on, and we've become somewhat more less problematic in the way that we think about travel and about experiencing other cultures. But I still love that kind of old campy picaresque thing. So I tried to revive that in a slightly woker way. Pieperesque, if you will. I'm so sorry. So there's that. But place is also, and I think this speaks to Josephine's work, because she's better than anyone at it, better than me at least. But the way that place and geography are inseparable from culture, and culture is inseparable from character. And when you work in fiction in particular, I think it's important to think about how place informs the formation of your characters, their motivations, their richness and their autonomy. And it gets very interesting, to go back to my start of the spiel with the picaresque, is when you take them out of that context and send them on a journey. That makes for very interesting narrative friction, I think.
Right. Yeah, I want to ask Josephine to catalogue her places in her Josephesque in a minute, but I wanted to quickly follow up on what you're saying about place and I guess the specificity of it, Liam, really quickly, because you aren't just writing about about places in this kind of old picaresque camp way, as you put it, where they're a place that there's something that's there to be discovered, or that's there to be exotic, or to take a character out of their familiar context, although they do that as well. You're really interested, I think, in the specificity of especially India. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Do you want the short, concise answer or the meandering one?
Maybe we could start with short and concise, and the meandering one will come out as we go.
Well, I love India. It's, this is not a controversial opinion for a middle-aged white guy to have, but I've been there several times, a couple of times just in the course of writing this. I've got a lot of good friends there. There's a lot of amazing literature coming out of it. And I guess I started to... a switch flipped for me some years ago. I was there on residency at this place called Sangam House, which is a writer's residency. I guess kind of culturally a bit like Varuna in the Australian context. So a place where writers from all different walks of life and different places will meet and just work all day, and then in the evening come together and discuss things. Everyone else there was Indian. I was the only gringo. And they were, I was struck by how little I understood about the place. I'd traveled through India a few times before. I'd seen different corners of it, but I'd never had more than a very facile traveler's tourist experience, and then I really got to know these people, by like a crime reporter from Mumbai, and a socialite from Delhi, and a guy from Tamil Nadu who was a farmer for most of his life and taught himself High Tamil, and now writes this beautifully poetic, erotic writing. Just this really sweet, unassuming guy who writes this transcendent and filthy these stories. And I had no idea about the specificity of those places, because I had what I guess is a colonial hangover. I thought of the entire nation under this rubric of India, I guess. And such a cosmopolitan and diverse place with like deep cultural roots, spanning a multitude of histories. It's hard for an Australian, I guess, to grasp that kind of, and by Australian, I mean post-colonial, European, descended Australian, to grasp that sense of place and country when, the only real cultural differences between cities is what we call potato cakes in some instances. This is the meandering answer, by the way. So I was struck by that, my ignorance, by my lack of understanding of the country. And even though I was deeply hungry for cultural experiences, because you can't get potato cakes in the middle of India. And so I wanted to explore that gap, that kind of dissonance when a traveler is deeply curious about another culture and wants to embrace it and get it, and understand something of it to enrich their own, I guess, picture of the world, and not quite getting it. It's something that every traveler does, and it's something that's been celebrated in literature for a long time. These travel narratives going back hundreds of years. There's a kind of impossibility in the form that I wanted to play with.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that idea of starting from a place of ignorance, but also, although that you can be specific about a place, and although you can ask questions about a place, your characters never kind of, get a proper grasp on the place. They're always sort of discovering and arriving, I think. And that reminds me a lot of really all of Josephine's stories, where so often your characters are between places, but also they're arriving in places, and there's a real sense of, I think that discovery is a weird word for it, because again, they're not arriving at a place of certainty, right? But they're questioning those places. What are those places, and what are the questions?
Okay, you wanted the catalogue?
Please.
Is that right? I will give it in a second. I just wanted to speak to Liam's book and that idea of specificity, and how immediately I was struck by the investment and the respect that's showed in depicting, is it Shanti in the first pages, Liam?
Yeah.
Just this very palimpsestic kind of layers build up on layers, and the different influences that have come through, and this kind of tangled Bunyan style approach to really sort of plumbing deep into an area and its various conflicted histories. And I thought that was just such an absorbing way to begin. I think that's what we all hope for and want to do in a book, whether you or not you have a character or a voice or a narrative that you can equip with that kind of awareness, and I suppose that wokeness as well of respecting a place. Sometimes sometimes the character does have a more sort of surface understanding of a place. And I don't think discovery is an unfair word, Ronnie, in terms of my stories. They definitely, I suppose discovery is ongoing, and a lot of the places that appear in Here Until August, the spark for those came from me being in different cities and in a fixed addressed kind of way. I was new, but it was important that I got a sense of the way of life there to, even just to sort of orientate. So my notebooks are often a sort of mixture of observations and maybe thoughts for fiction and kind of interspersed with my own experiences and commentary as well. And I think that helps in mapping out a new city or a new sort of a new aspect of your life, because you are a slightly different version of yourself according to where you are. That sort of the impact of psychogeography, I suppose.
Right.
I should get to the catalogue. Where do we start? We start in West Australia, in a small town, but we kind of reach over to Scotland. That's in Glisk. In real life, we're mostly in Montreal. Anything remarkable, we are in upstate New York for the most part at the time of the vote for marriage equality in Australia. In Sinkers, we are in a non-specific town in the Snowy Mountains scheme, and one of the drowned towns. In post-structuralism for beginners, we're somewhere in suburban Melbourne. In Chavez, we are in an unnamed American city, USA. The Once Drowned Man, again, we're in upstate New York, hopefully headed towards Canada, and then reaching back into other places and other histories that both of the characters are quite wary about sharing with each other. They don't quite trust each other enough to go into in too deeply into their pasts. In a small cleared space, we're in Newfoundland in Canada. Horse latitudes, we are crossing the Nullarbor, and in what passes for fun, we're in upstate New York again.
That's quite an itinerary. Is there a favorite? When you think about places to write about, obviously you could write about any place that you've been to, and obviously when you go to a new place, you kind of experience things like a writer because you are figuring out the right way to position yourself in relation to them. You're thinking of the right way. You're often communicating with other people about what that place is like. But
trying to learn a language and failing.
Right. Is there a particular place where you were doing that and failing to do it?
I'm very bad at languages. I think I'm often very shy in person in a new place. So and also sounding dumb. I'm not brave enough to sound dumb in a new language, and so I just which I think is a strong flaw for living elsewhere.
I don't think
that's.
I'm not sure that's a flaw. I'm quite brave at sounding dumb in all sorts of languages.
And you're probably more proficient than I am, though.
I wouldn't say that. Sorry.
No, please, go on. I think that one of the interesting things about your pieces is that they do give this very strong sense of place, and they give a strong sense of otherness in a place, but also, I mean the otherness of the narrator, but also they're not just sketches of place, they're stories. And so we're often really firmly with a character who's on the verge of deciding something, or they're trying very hard not to admit to themselves that they've decided something, or they're running away from something. And I wonder how that colors the way that you shape a vision of a place. Like, is it always coming through a character's emotional state? or is it sort of, there's more things going on than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the story. I think I need one of either things to click properly, and that's place or voice. And sometimes those things are deeply and conveniently intertwined. One colors the other. You know, in the same way that I think you feel your sort of your thinking and your sensibilities shift depending on where you're living and what you are, you know, what's in your visual field even. I think I thought very differently when I was living in Hobart. And I could open my front door and there was Kunani, the mountain, and the back door there's the estuary, and something about being positioned between, you know, these two things that are these two sort of strong, natural, cardinal directions, I think, with I mean, calming in a lot of ways, but and gave a lot of perspective on whatever was happening in my kind of short human lifespan. But so for some of the stories, it is very much a character responding to a new place, or as you said, kind of running from somewhere. So sort of there's the projection of the old place, or there's this constant measuring between where they have come from and where they are headed, or where they currently are trying to bring a sense of home or grounding to.
Yeah, and I think that that's true of Sweetness and Light as well. So Liam, you have these two primary characters, Connor and Sasha, and we often get their alternating viewpoints on a particular place or experience, but they're also, while they're discovering these places separately and together, they are very much, Josephine's words were running from something. I wonder how it is that you kept those motivations clear for the characters and the reader, while also not giving a sense that the story was being dragged down into the past. I think you did a really good job of kind of taking a sort of back and forth between what the characters are doing and what motivates them, and giving the reader a really full picture of those things. How did you work with the past and with time in Sweetness and Light?
I tend to use time as a crutch, as whenever I can't, whenever I find myself in a narrative cul-de-sac and I find the action dragging, I'm like, what's going on in the past? How did the characters get to here? And in this case, at least, I was very concerned with how the past is integral to the present. I wanted to play with that idea of what's that word? Fate. Whether we can truly escape our formative experiences, be they traumatic or whatever other kind of experience people have. I can't recall right now. But that is integral as well to place. These people, the characters, are very much a product of the place they come from, and although they're running as fast as they can to get away from that in various ways and methods and dubious moral avenues, you can never really run that fast. But place important. Something that Josephine said just now, if I can drag it back to place for a moment. Place is so integral to the story. One that voice or place has to click. Absolutely. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes I feel it's almost. This will sound quite wishy-washy and maybe a bit mad, but often I'll walk into a place and and it's like the character is waiting there for me, you know, a little like, you know, in a sandbox role-playing game on the PlayStation, for example. When you walk along, and occasionally you'll come across an area or a character who has a quest for you. Often I'll go to a place and the story is just there, and it just presents itself. Connor, in my book, was one of these characters. He is an amalgam of several sort of scumbags I've met in Western India over the years, expats of various Western nations, but very much physically modelled on a couple of key characters I knew in my youth. Yeah, he's not a very nice guy, but he has his reasons.
Did you want to read us some of Connor's story?
I could.
Please.
Shall I? Okay. Probably a little bit of background. So Connor is, he's not quite a sex worker, and he's not quite a con man, but he's something in between. And he just kind of hangs out on this tourist beach, Shanty Beach, which is a fictional creation, but kind of loosely modelled on, you know, the generic tourist beaches you'll find in many countries around the world that have kind of been taken over by Western expats. And he has a shtick where he, to get to know his marks, the women he's trying to seduce, he'll take them out on a dive boat and take them through this scuba diving wreck that he runs expeditions to, sort of in an effort to get uncomfortably close to them. He's the more unsavory parts of Connor's character are modelled on. Do you know that book, The Game? Do you remember that?
Josephine?
Josephine, I know you're a big fan.
I definitely feel like I have met men who have read The Game and studied it hard.
So I read that as part of the research for this book, and it's a horror story. But anyway, that guy's taking our other character out on the dive in this. Another character out on the dive, a woman he's just met. We begin. But first, the best part of the dive, the float through the guts of the ship. Taking her hand, he guides the talent. Addendum. Talent is what he calls the women he's working on. He guides the talent to the mouth of the wreck and then into it. He draws her close, embraces her so they float horizontal to the sea floor, and then, with one flipper, turns them around so she is upside down, staring up to the surface. Through her faceplate, he sees her take in the reef around them, the motes of silt dancing in the water above, stuck in the shafts of light, sees her eyes widen, the exclamation of delight muffled by her regulator. Oh. They are wearing the thinnest of wetsuits, and through the neoprene, he feels the tension in her back, the delicate, barely there muscles. Connor allows himself the subtlest caress, one hand on her hip, the other on her forearm, and then he pushes away, putting slight torque on her so she spins in dreamlike pirouettes as she drifts through the carcass of the ship. Connor leaves her to marvel, kicks forcefully up ahead, and swims up the slight incline to the bottom of the wreck, where it sprawls upward and suddenly vanishes over the coastal shelf. This is the secret of the wreck. The mellow current draws you through the reef like a dream, but in the final few meters, as the warm waters of the reef are sucked down into the abyss, the flow unexpectedly picks up and hurdles divers out over the coastal shelf and down. 1 second you're floating in the shelter of the reef, clownfish darting playfully in and out of anemones, and the next you're snatched by a rip that sweeps you out into the infinite black. It's dangerous, but only if you don't know what you're doing, and Connor knows what he's doing. While the talent dawdles through the wreck, Connor powers ahead, and he'll be waiting over the abyss to catch her when the current seizes her and drags her down. He'll take her in his arms, and then they'll swim together to the surface, but not before she's had a moment of stomach-dropping terror, the depths of the ocean calling her to her doom. His thesis: everybody likes adventure, and even if they don't, they like the idea of adventure. Few people want to think of themselves as no fun, or else they would never get on a boat with him in the first place. Everyone is wired the same way. The best way to bring someone to life is to shock them, to give them a taste of the void, a glimpse of the endless, freezing cold that lies outside the comfort zone. Nobody ever feels as alive as they do the instant they realize, viscerally, the possibility that they could end, that life is finite. Every experience becomes a symphony of taste and texture. Breakfast the next morning, the incredible richness of a pop song on the radio as a truck goes roaring past your car, the feeling of air in your parched lungs as you surface from the deep. Sex. Even the most mediocre sex is elevated. The most fizzled squib of a climax is glorious if you thought that you would have no more. Connor has come to believe that's what everybody is looking for, why they trail through this town, through this state, this country, this forsaken beach, a chance to feel alive by any means necessary. He's done this before, many times, knows that when he surfaces with the talent in his arms, she'll find herself a new person, every nerve ending alive with possibility. Connor doesn't want to take any chances in this shop with this poor visibility. He waits, braced against the cliff edge, for the talent to come over the lip. And when she comes, she's moving faster than he expects, not drifting with the current, but barreling along with it, big kicks and sweeping breaststroke powering her forward. Just a flash of fin and wetsuit, and then she's gone into the black. Connor is after her in a second, and then he's alone in the void. Visibility is down to nothing. He listens desperately for some clue, but his bad ear is useless, and the good one confounded by his own ragged breathing, the roar of the outboard motor of the boat starting up on the surface. Taking a guess, he duck dives, stretches out a hand, and miracle, it lands on a fin. The other swimmer is panicked, no longer confident but flailing, bubbles from the regulator spraying all over the place, blinding Connor. By tugging on her arm, Connor is able to communicate. Up, up. He takes her weight, reaches down to her dive belt and drops her ballast, kicks up. Only when they break the surface, when he reaches for the mask to reassure her, does he realize what has happened. Don't touch me, the man snaps, another of the men on the dive boat, muddled and embarrassed. I'm fine, you back right up. Connor dives again, down, into the black, down and fast and far as he can until his lungs sing and the pressure in his ears threaten to cave his head in. He stops, forces himself to think. There is no sign of her in the wreck or out in the blackness of the coastal shelf. He kicks down deeper, feels his good ear screaming in protest, realizes he's risking the bends, and hovers. A loose neutron, vibrating in agonized uncertainty. Something is wrong with the world, with the water, furious around him. Chunks of coral and steel are breaking off the wreck and flying by him. Something is unreal and unstrung about everything. Maybe he's already dived too quickly, nitrogen in the blood, making him loopy. He starts kicking up. When he breaches the surface and tears off his mask, he finds the wind is wild, hot and wet. The changes in the air. The monsoon has arrived with fury, the rain coming in fat, sharp needles against his face. The boat is ripped free from its anchor and is heading back to shore, and far away on land, he hears the bell on the church tower tolling wildly as the wind whips it back and forth, and Connor, hoping against hope, swims for the boat. I'll leave it there. How does it end? Probably fine for everyone.
Thank you. I really love how kind of no matter how scummy a character is, and you introduce him as scummy, when you see the world through somebody's eyes and experience place in a situation through somebody's eyes, you sort of can't help but connect to them emotionally, and I think that's true of Connor in that scene. What about you, Josephine? When you, we've talked about the ways that different characters in your stories experience place and how that connects to the way that you experience place. But Liam was also talking about how when he goes to a location, sometimes the entire story is presented by the situation itself and the characters as well. Do you find that as well?
Yeah, I think, I've said elsewhere that writing at its best is like remembering, or like sort of dreaming. Everything's sort of there, and there's that sort of satisfaction of it sort of rising to the surface as you kind of go along and find out what the story is. But often place can just have that resonance about it that stays with you for a while. Often I feel like there's a sort of accrual of things I sort of collect, and something might sit around for years before it sort of sparks into what it felt like it was always going to be, but maybe needed time to get there. And going back to a question you asked earlier, why those places in the collection? I think I write about everywhere I go, and sometimes places that I do not. And I think if I did not move around so much, I think my fiction would still sort of be kind of peripatetic. It would still rove. That question you asked Liam about past, I think Sweetness and Light is such a great example of, you know, what a sort of bad creative writing teacher would dismiss as backstory or as too much backstory, because there's this very facile idea of the past and how it's supposed to be treated, as though anything that happens in the past tense is backstory, as though it doesn't keep happening, and as though it doesn't keep bearing down on the present. And, you know, whoever the character is by that point is still, you know, tied back to whoever they were when they were 6 or 12 or 24, and all of these formative things kind of echo down the line. So I really liked the way that the novel lingers and doesn't treat, you know, events from 10 or 20 years ago as though they're just filler, or as though they're just supposed to explain something happening in this particular place. It really does serve to give a rich idea of who these people are and who they might become, whether or not, you know, they succeed in doing that. In some ways, various ways they do and don't. Sorry, going back to your question of...
But now I'm thinking about time and the way that you handle time in your stories. I think like there are some similarities there as well. You have this very kind of shuttling might be wrong, but your stories sometimes feel like they're moments. They're very kind of vivid and very clarifying, but they're also really expansive in that they do encompass characters' histories and show us how they influence the way that characters think in the present. And I wondered as well about the idea of grief and how so many of your stories do focus on characters dealing with something pretty explicitly from the past.
Grief is a great example of how time works, because we, you know, something terrible happens, and that, you know, we get through it in various ways, and it, you know, flattens us immediately, or for others, or in other circumstances, it's sort of that is delayed or parceled out. Definitely there are characters who are very actively trying to sort of evade grief and sort of dealing with things by throwing geographical distance between themselves and this great tragedy. But grief can sneak up on you and feel as fresh 20 years later as it did at the time of being told, you know, that somebody that you love is dead, or you know, a relationship that mattered to you deeply has ended, or you have had this extraordinary humiliation. I don't know I think that's a very universal human experience, is the sort of the ways in which that can be utterly confounding, because it can feel like, you know, I dealt with it, I wrote a book about it, it doesn't have the same amount of power. And then, you know, the smallest innocuous objects, or, you know, any sort of trigger or link can bring you right back there. So I think for these characters, there are a few of them who have kind of thrown themselves into very different circumstances so as not to have these reminders or these links, these opportunities for grief to find them. And very often they do through sort of unexpected ways.
Did you want to read something that deals with the past in a particular way?
Yes, actually, I think, one second. That request can tie to the passage I was planning to read anyway. It's something of an echo to Liam's segment. This is a not drowning passage. I thought I'd read a little from the start of the first story, Glisk. And I'm just going to, if I hold my phone this way, my arms are getting very tired. Is that okay? Or do I look odd?
No, you look great.
Oh, I can see both of you if I hold it this way. And my arm, sorry, to explain to the audience, I don't have the internet in my home because I'm secretly 80, but it's on my phone. So I'm just doing a fancy version of FaceTiming. And that is so much nicer on my shoulder. So if I can stay like that for a little while. Okay, Glisk. We are wading out, the 5 of us. I remember this. The sun an hour or 2 from melting into the ocean, the slick trail of its gold showing the way we will take. Ahead of me, my tiny sister sits regal and unafraid in the middle of the raft that Finn has built out of packing foam and empty chemical buckets, lids fixed airtight with caulk. He's already tested it out in the neighbor's pool and declared it seaworthy, but if the thing falls apart, he has promised to carry Sarah himself. Finn is 13, older than me by 5 years, and the only one of us 3 kids who has been out to the island before. Our mother had long hair then, and Finn's dad was still around, hadn't yet skidded his motorbike underneath a road train one rainy December night. My dad, Finn's dad too now, Mum constantly reminds us, shoulders a picnic basket filled with Sarah's favourites, Finn's favourites, Mum's favourites, mine. Cheese and apple sandwiches, salt and vinegar chips, slivers of mango doused with lime and chili, ginger beer. Enough food to last a week, though we'll be crossing back to the mainland this same night, lit by a quarter moon and a $2 torch. The people around us hardly seem like people, more like a muster of herd animals. They move steadily through the water in 1s and 2s, feeling for the slope of the sandbar underfoot, the treacherous edge where the ocean floor falls away. And that's how people, tourists mostly, get themselves drowned, snatched off by rips. The sea, the terrible. Yep, we say, we know. Dad gets wordy sometimes. There are other families, some towing small children on boogie boards, inflatable lilos, nothing so fine as Sarah's raft. Coolers bob alongside clothes tied inside plastic shopping bags, silver jellyfish balloons with day-glow guts. We're lucky, Dad's telling us. Today's a neap tide, safest time to make a crossing, the highest tide not so high, the deepest part not so deep. Farther out, the island looks like a rough dog slouching up from the ocean, muzzle pointed northwest. What's out there? A lot of putrid birds, Finn's already told me, and some aurat caves, mobs of bogans sinking tinnies. Nothing awesome. But tonight, after sunset, the shores around the island will be aglow with the visiting swarm of bioluminescent phytoplankton on their anxious, brilliant way to who knows where. We'll perch along the highest bluff in a sprawl of blankets, while the waves crash iridescent against the rocks below, sweeping away to leave lonely blue stars stranded here and there then charging back in to reclaim them. It will be spectacular, an eerie sort of magic, and I will never see anything like it again. But whatever, this isn't the point. In the end, the island is just a dog-shaped rock, covered with birds and sunburnt gawkers, temporarily surrounded by terrified dinoflagellates. It's this wading out that matters, this crossing, the bright, migratory animalness of it, going waist deep, chest deep, waist deep again. What matters is how, halfway over, Finn looks back at us, then ahead again, and he says to no one or everyone, or maybe just to Sarah, I reckon this is how the afterlife must look. And then there's, I'll just jump ahead to a little passage where it's sort of situated, the now of the story is situated. Years later, somewhere into adulthood, I'll decide that this is a story to one day tell at my brother's wedding, or else his funeral. Possibly both, as with a certain kind of suit, it seems workable for either occasion. Instead of the wedding and/or funeral speech, though sure, there's still time for both, I'm delivering this story to my wife, trying to wrest my brother back from what local mythology has made of him. Careless idiot at best, murderer at worst. T has been driving past those crosses at the shoulder of High Ridge Road for years, since before we even met. Shed made, white as desert bleached bones, coated with a fresh layer of paint every spring, strung with teddy bears, ribbons, other sentimental lark. Trinkets refresh each September. The grandparents' work, we suspect, the father too modest for that sort of rubbish. This is all T knows of my brother. This and the couple 3 cards he sent and the shed full of furniture he left behind, all gliding teak curves and high-tension wires. Mid-century harpsichord, T calls it, explaining how their father was a luthier when friends admire at the coffee table, the only piece that makes sense with the rest of the house. My father, I'll sometimes add. My father was a luthier. Why, T wants to know. Would your brother come back here? I ask myself the same. We'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. And thank you both for reading as well from the starts of your books. I think that that kind of brings us back to maybe one last question for each of you, and tying back to something that I said at the start and something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last week when kind of looking at your 2 books together. One of my favorite things about them is, again, that idea of trust in the reader, that idea that the start of your projects really sets up a set of expectations that you then kind of play with, either across the novel or from story to story. And you get a lot of really interesting effects and tensions and surprises out of that, and fulfill those promises and subvert them in different ways. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that trust in the reader, or about the kind of story that you're setting up, and what you hope people will get out of your books.
May I pivot from that to a small,
Yes.
Lots of praise for Josephine. In terms of trust in the reader, I was struck, particularly reading the work, but particularly now hearing it aloud, how much trust you have in the reader, how much space you leave for them to discover the depth of the work. If I was writing a similar piece to that, I would have panicked and put in 70,000 words of backstory, whereas there's such grace and earlier, I would have a tendency to really pound the backstory, whereas the echoes of the grief explored in that passage in particular really refract and shimmer in the present. Anyway, That's all. I forget what the question is now.
That's okay. Thank you. Josephine, what about trust? What about contracts you set up with the reader?
Oh, yeah, trust.
Yeah, it's sort of. Thank you, Liam. I'll come back to that in a sec, because I think you do actually leave those spaces open in really crucial moments in your book. Trust and space, I suppose. As a reader, sometimes I find that the most vivid interactions with a book or a story or a poem is when there is that silence, I think you called before, Ronnie, to kind of project into. And that makes it, that makes it different for every reader. I think if you encapsulate enough of it precisely enough, and then, I think of those line drawings where, part is just like incredibly detailed and intricate, and then it sort of drifts away into something more impressionistic. I think you can sometimes engage with those stories a little more viscerally and personally. Sometimes with me, the fact of the matter is it's a short story. And so there's an awful lot I have to leave out if I want to, get the substance of whatever counts for plot as far as my stories are concerned, which is mostly about human interaction. And but Liam, with Sweetness and Light, I actually was really interested in the way you chose or did not choose to show violence, because there are points where a very violent act is only kind of understood in its aftermath, and then others where it's a violence or a form of abuse is highly detailed. And I thought one of the interesting choices, or one of the choices I really appreciated for that sort of bodily, visceral detail of violence was when Connor is, I don't think this is giving too much away, but he's sort of forced by his father to swim all of these laps in the freezing cold ocean, and just the sort of bodily awareness and the physical harm that causes was so exquisitely written. And then later on in that section, there's something else that happens that is sort of more physically traumatic, I suppose, or it's a different kind of trauma, but you kind of left that off the page. Can I ask, what was your thinking around that?
Part of it ties into the psychology of the character. He's been able to process some of his trauma and redistribute that into his later life, I suppose. It's a key part of the formation of the character. The other violent event, sometimes things will happen to you that you just never deal with, and so you sort of push it, I guess, into the deep backstory. So that was part of it. Part of it was just, again, like all my writing, a cheap narrative trick, because that ellipsis can sometimes be really fascinating, that negative space, leave a little room to breathe. I enjoyed that. Also, it's still a novel. I want people to be able to read it. And unrelenting bleakness, it's fun for me, but it might not be for all readers. So I wanted to leave a little bit of space for a holiday in there. Plus, I just didn't want to be too gratuitous. I have a tendency to be too gratuitous in some of my writing, and it's already an extremely horny book. You know, I didn't want to overload the censors, but in terms of that trust of the reader, they'll get it. You know, readers are smart, or else they're not reading books. You know, it's okay to
I
take a
disagree
chance.
with you there. I think when people talk about, you know, whatever audience you write for, I do like to imagine whoever is reading it is probably smarter than I am.
This
certainly
is a
better
given with me.
educated.
This is certainly something I've thought about. But to flip it back to you, in terms of depicting what you want to depict, and what actually goes explicitly on the page, and what is left to, I guess, that ellipsis. My favourite story in this collection, if I may, I've forgotten the name of, but it is.
That's okay. What happens in it? I'll probably know it.
I think the second to the last, when it's two people driving across a desert.
Horse Latitudes.
Horse Latitudes.
The Nullarbor. Right.
Now, a masterclass.
You're going to ask me about the ending?
No, I'll get there.
You.
But it's really a masterpiece in sublimation, in longing and regret, which are the same emotion in my range. But I got to the bottom of it, and I immediately went back and tried to figure out how you did it. I was like, I'm just never going to crack this. I was wondering, again, if I may ask,
Go ahead.
how does that story come to you? Is it a process of winnowing away until you have exactly the right story on the page, or is it something more organic?
There would have been lots over the several years it took me to write. The collection all up took about 7 years to write, and some of the stories were kind of worried at for that amount of time. They've been through, so many different versions of themselves. When I started out on this collection, which was interrupted by the novel, I was really interested in Australian place-based mythologies. So, the Nullarbor and the colonial idea of the Nullarbor, and even the name is, there's so much hubris kind of laid in there. I think I wrote all of these stories at remove from where they're set. And so I think there is a sort of, there is that kind of vividness that memory and longing can bring, hopefully not in a nostalgic sense, but certain things crystallize. How did I go about what particular aspects of the, what to leave in there?
Yeah, I want to be able to copy you at some
sure.
point. And there was I guess it stems back to a point I articulated poorly earlier about, I have a great admiration for your ability to suggest an emotional depth to the characters in a spare and graceful way. Does that make any sense?
No, that's wonderful. I mean, that's a high compliment.
It's still not a question.
Well, you're in luck.
How do I get to it? I suppose word lengths or word restrictions are helpful to that end, because, once you start to spill over 5,000 or 6,000 words, nobody's going to publish it. Although I still kind of ran over the edges of some of them, and that's okay. You meet them in the book for the first time. With Horse Latitudes, you just sort of, you kind of whittle it down. I don't know how else to say it.
That works, whittling.
Like I said, there would have been more there before, and then you sort of, choose whatever is most representative of the character as you come to know them. I suppose we're just working with, potent signifiers along the way. What is going to give you this person in the shortest, sharpest way. What piece on the Monopoly, what little icon on the Monopoly board do you associate with?
Gotcha. Beautifully put. That's, yeah.
Thank you both. And I think that we have to wrap it up because we've run out of time. But they're both such good books, and thank you for speaking about them so generously and so eloquently. The two books are Here Until August by Josephine Rowe and Sweetness and Light by Liam Pieper. And thank you for joining us on the live stream from the Wheeler Centre Double Book Club. Have a good night.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks, Liam.